to another edition of our expert Q&A here on Up and to the Right from Gradient Works. And I want to welcome Lisa Salinas today. So really excited to have her. So Lisa, tell us about you and your background.
Hi, Hayes. Thanks for having me today. So I'm a commercial attorney. I'm currently at a company called SpyCloud. We are the leaders in account takeover prevention. We help our customers ensure that the people logging into their systems and networks, their customers, their end users, etc., are all who they say they are. Prior to this, I was at Trendkite, which is an online media monitoring service, which is where I met you when we acquired Union Metrics. And we have been trading smart remarks over text for about 2 years now. Yeah, definitely.
I think so, yeah.
Prior to my startup experience, I was at Apple, where I was both in the contracts department and then later the commercial legal department. And I started my career off at Xerox doing contract management in their infrastructure services department.
Cool.
So
okay.
I've been doing commercial legal for about 10 years now. A lot of it heavy on contracts.
Okay. All right. That's awesome. And I want to say that your backdrop there is gorgeous. Where are you actually sitting right now?
I am sitting on the deck of a house in Acadia National Park. So this is Maine in all its fall glory. Well, I think it will be full fall glory in about 2 weeks.
Right. Well, that is pretty awesome. So, all right, well, let's switch from the fall glory of Maine to the exciting world of commercial legal operations. So
exciting, the most exciting.
I know. It is exciting, and I think it's also super critical. A lot of folks who listen to this are, they're in fairly high velocity SaaS organizations. There's a lot of contracts, and they need to get done quickly and at a low risk and efficiently, and all of those things have to happen. So, and it's always a tricky thing to get right. So, I want to start by just kind of level setting on a couple of things here. We talked about commercial legal, right? But I think it's always good to take a step back and say, all right, well, what's the difference between, in your perception, between commercial legal and corporate legal, sort of the standard corporate legal team? Where does one start and where does the other begin?
So in my perspective, corporate legal is the lawyer or the portion of the lawyer's time that's paying attention to sort of the underpinnings of the business. Are you registered where you need to be registered? Are you following all of your governance? Helping with the board meeting, helping either run the board meeting or organize for it. Commercial legal is purely about sales. In my perspective, think commercial legal should consider themselves to be part of the sales team. So you're kind of separate and apart. You've got the risk management responsibilities of a lawyer, but you're also there to function as a way to enable sales. So you're actually part of the sales enablement team. Without you, sales don't really get done. While most people would prefer to not have contracts, unfortunately, the world doesn't work that way. And not just from a legal perspective, from an accounting perspective too. So you do need to have contracts, and you do need to have someone there who understands the risks to the business, but also understands that business just needs to get done. And so that's kind of where commercial legal comes in.
Okay, so I think that makes a ton of sense. So it's really about balancing the needs of the go-to-market part of the business with, potential risks. And so I think one of the things I've always thought about when it comes to legal is when you're striking that balance, if all you care about is sales velocity, like you said, you could just never have a contract, right? Which is probably not what you necessarily want to do. And so, what's some advice that you would offer about how to think about striking that balance correctly between the trade-offs of risk you might be taking on as a company and the sales velocity you can have by maybe not spending as much time in red lines?
So it's all about simplicity in your legal terms. Having plain language drafting, so contracts that are easy to read, that a business partner could read as well as a lawyer could read. Having good relationships with your leadership team. So when I come to drafting a template, if I come to a new company or I'm revamping a template for a certain product, I'm going to talk to all of the relevant stakeholders, my execs on the product side, on the business side, on the sales side, to really understand what their concerns are and then come up with a document that balances all of those. Do we have particular risk with a product? You know, in SpyCloud, we have a lot of privacy issues that we need to address because our product is heavy on personally identifiable information, or PII. So I'm going to take into account what our privacy and compliance guy says. But I also want to structure it in such a way that I'm addressing the risks of the company in a way that my customers can understand. So if I do have to get on the phone with them to explain what a particular provision is, it's easy and it's more of an explanation than a negotiation or a disagreement. It's really all about balance.
Okay. All right. All right. So, one of the things that I think is really important is having your sales team understand when to pull legal into a conversation, right? You don't want to do it too early. You also want to make sure that legal has all the context that they need to come into the conversation and efficiently, deal with whatever the concern is. So can you talk about that a little bit? What should sales provide to legal? When should legal get involved? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think it's important that a commercial legal counsel or a team prepare their reps for understanding and issue spotting when red lines come in. So I don't need them to go negotiate complex legal provisions, but I do need them to be able to identify them. So one of the things that I do with my teams is have red, yellow, green training. You know, green, small things, late fee payments, certain governing law provisions if I've given them alternatives. There's a low level playbook that they're allowed to make changes on that they don't need to involve me, because those are low risk changes. And I would just become a bottleneck in that point. Red, if there's particularly anything in the limitations of liability or indemnity clauses where you're starting to get into the risk shifting provisions, absolutely they need to bring me in, and they understand that when that happens, the sales cycle is going to slow a little bit, but I'm going to do my best to make sure that the deal keeps moving forward. So doing training, issue spotting training with your teams is really important so that they can become a self-service team and help themselves negotiate the legal process faster with or without your help.
So, what do you see as the right relationship between, the commercial legal team and sales operations?
I think commercial legal and sales operations should actually work really close together. And there's a bridge called contract operations that can either live with sales ops or commercial legal, depending on how operationally and data driven your legal team is. If your legal team just wants to focus on being lawyers and negotiating contracts and looking up laws, then contract ops absolutely can sit with sales ops. And the real driver there is that you want to have good template management. So having the correct contracts matched to the correct products. Legal should you typically own the templates, but contract ops can own the matching, and then any kind of system administration. So if you're using a contracts lifecycle management tool, uh, I am a lawyer. I've had CLMs before. I am not great at being a sysadmin. So having somebody who has that sort of technical expertise, but also understands workflows, especially approval workflows, is really, really great. And generally, that's what sales ops brings to legal. So legal has the ideas of how they want to manage the risk, and sales ops has the skills about how to actually implement that in the org. Good running company, they should work together pretty well.
Okay, well, so let's talk a little bit more about contract lifecycle management. For those of us who have spent quite a bit of time on the ops side, we think about CLM as a product category, a thing we need to go implement, right? But I think it's useful usually when there's a product category like that to step back and say, okay, let's ignore all the vendors and stuff for a second, and let's just actually think about managing the life cycle of a contract, right? And so irrespective of what some vendor tells us their product can do. And so if you were to take us through that and say, how do you view the life cycle of a contract? What are the key stages that companies need to be thinking about, totally outside of implementing a specific CLM solution?
Yeah, so for me, from a contract ops slash legal perspective, it really starts at the opportunity level, right? So before you even generate a contract, do you have all of the correct pieces? Do you have the products? Do you have the prices? Do you have the service terms? Do you have the terms and conditions that are going to apply? And can those all effectively be packaged up together? Whether you're doing that manually, which I wouldn't recommend, or automatically dynamically generating it with a CLM, at some point it has to be done. Then it moves out to the prospect, who gets an opportunity to look at it. ideally, you struck a good balance with your terms so that there's minimal red lines, if any. Maybe you've even put your terms on the website to sort of ease friction, to make it easier for people to just sign the order form and move on with their lives. But occasionally you get people who want something different. So then you've got to go into the negotiation process. You're never going to get people out of Word, and you're probably never going to get them out of email. So that's one thing to consider when you're looking at vendors. You know, a lot of them have really fancy redlining functionality, but adoption is a good consideration. Not everybody is going to want to move into your system. You have to accommodate what your prospects want to do. So then you have to figure out how to manage that communication, making sure that you have the right version control, that the prospect's not sending out anything you didn't approve. And then when you get that, you've got to finalize it, package it up, and then make sure that it gets effectively executed. So there has to be some kind of signature component. Almost nobody does wet signatures anymore. Typically, there's some kind of e-signature software that's included in any vendor that you're looking at, but you do want to make sure that you understand how those contracts are getting executed. And that's just getting to the point of signature. After that, you have to figure out where you're going to file it, how easily accessible it is to the various people who need it. It's usually not just legal who needs to look at the contract. Often customer success needs access to see if there's any special provisions. Accounting needs to see it in order to recognize the revenue, do the booking, to make sure that everybody who needs access to that contract has access to that contract. And then a lot of times people don't consider this, but you can actually derive a lot of data from your contracts. One of the things that I like to do is metadata tagging on my contracts, so I can tie how frequently I negotiate contracts to the value that I'm bringing to the organization. So tagging contracts and then watching the trends between revenue generated from standard contracts versus negotiated contracts helps you keep track of, maybe if too many people are negotiating, you need to revise your terms, or maybe that's just life as it is now and you need to add headcount because there's too much volume and to meet your velocity commitments. So yeah, it's really a full life cycle, end to end.
So I love this idea of thinking about contracts as all this metadata attached and all the things that you can learn to make your processes better. When you're thinking about kind of that post-signature life cycle, because I think this is something sales doesn't always think too much about, right? Especially if you're on the new business, the acquisition side of things, like you're excited once you get the signature. You don't think much about what happens after that necessarily, right? And that makes
They
sense.
don't think, yeah,
And
yeah.
so, but I think from a commercial legal perspective, being able to say, these are the things that we see an awful lot, and this is the value I'm bringing to the business. But one other thing is, I think being able to quantify the risk maybe that you're taking on in these contracts is really interesting to me. So maybe you've stretched on your limitations of liability, these kinds of ways. So how do you think about quantifying the risk from sort of your contract base, if you will, to the rest of the company? Like, how do you communicate about that to executives and leadership?
Yeah, so there's some elements of the contract that you can pretty easily quantify. If you've got a standard limitation of liability, say, 12, the last 12 months of fees paid, but you've done a multiplier, you can keep track of that, and then you can
Mhm.
compare, the value of your contract portfolio to the risk that you've undertaken. Um, this works if you don't very often offer uncapped limitations of liability, which I
Sure.
don't recommend.
Mhm.
Some of them are a little bit harder to quantify, but you can make an effort. So, for instance, if you want to keep an eye on jurisdictions where you may eventually be sued, you want to ensure you are always in one or two particular jurisdictions, but if you step outside of those, reporting out onto the leadership team how frequently you're taking on alternative governing law jurisdictions, how frequently you are adding indemnities that maybe are outside the typical scope of what you might offer, and then reporting out at least on those instances on a regular basis so they can see how much variability that you're having in the contract. Obviously, when you've created a template, you've all come together as stakeholders and agreed that this is the risk portfolio that is ideal for our company. And then when you do post signature reporting, you can see how frequently you're varying outside of that particular risk portfolio and in what ways. And that helps your leadership team sort of make decisions about whether the business that you're undertaking is maybe a little too risky, or if you can afford to, move for certain customers for certain deal sizes.
Got it. Okay. What do you think most companies get wrong about their contracts?
So a lot of people don't put as much thought into the balance of risk when they first start out. Typically, they've been given a template by their outside counsels, or they've found one on the internet. They're not looking at what the risk profile is for their particular business. And I see you kind of smiling. I'm wondering if you did that before.
It's
But
possible. I may have snagged some terms of service to start with once upon a time, but yes.
Yeah. And so when you do something like that, you're just sort of perpetuating risk across your customer portfolio. So engaging legal counsel early on, whether it's outside counsel or even just a friend who's like, can you look at this for me before I go to market, is always really valuable. And then not thinking about contracts as an actual portion of operations, right? It's just a lot of people think of it as like something I just have to do in order to book the business. But it's really central to the entire sales process, right? So once you get to the point where someone is ready to commit, that contract becomes sort of the embodiment of your agreement. And if you guys aren't on the same page, it causes a lot of problems later on in the customer success lifestyle or the customer success life cycle. So making sure that the contract is good to begin with, and that the processes that you have around the contract flow easily, are things that I think a lot of companies really struggle with. Generally, just because they're not thinking about contracts as a form of operations, but just as a need to, a business tax.
Sure. Okay. And so I know, one area that there's sometimes friction in organizations is between the go-to-market leadership, the sales leadership that is really focused on hitting this number this quarter, and by God, we just got to get this deal over the line. And the legal folks who are saying, well, yes, but it's in this jurisdiction we've never agreed to, and it's uncapped, liability, and we got to be careful about this. And so what would be the one thing you would want to say to revenue leaders to say, to make sure that that relationship works as well as it possibly can?
I'm actually on your team, so I'm not trying to make life hard for you. If you have a good commercial legal counsel, they will actually view themselves as part of the sales enablement team, and they will work to do the best they can to get any kind of contract within the parameters of risk that your leadership team has defined. In my personal philosophy, it's not generally up to me to make the final call on risk. I get us as close as possible to the best deal that we can get. And then I take it to my leadership team and I say, hey, is this good enough for you? And it's really up to the business to decide whether they want to take on the risk. Um, so once you come to your sales leaders with that sort of philosophy and they understand that you are not trying to block sales, they're generally more receptive to listening to what you have to say about a particular deal, and less likely to complain that you're just trying to block their business.
Sure. Okay. Okay. Well, thanks so much, Lisa. This has been really, really useful. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask. I always like to check and see at SpyCloud. Do you guys have any open roles or anything that you want to tell our audience about?
Yeah, absolutely. So we just closed our Series C. We raised $30 million from Centana Growth Partners out in New York. So we're looking to expand in multiple jurisdictions, launch some new products. We're hiring a ton, especially Director of Revenue Operations, which is a role near and dear to my heart because I will be working closely with that person on a CLM implementation. So if you're interested, you can check out our careers page at spycloud.com, and we'd love to chat with you.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you very much. This has been a great chat.